No food, no water. Only the Apache widow's milk kept him alive in the ruthless desert. The sun rose over the desert like a blazing ball of fire, turning the vast stretches of sand and rock into a golden sea. Thomas had been planning this journey for months. He was not just a traveler. He was an explorer at heart, curious about the unknown and eager to witness the untouched beauty of the desert. Maps and guides could only tell so much, and Thomas wanted to feel the desert for himself, to see its hidden wonders and to understand its secrets. With a small caravan, he set out early in the morning, hopeful and full of energy. The first day was exciting. The desert was more magnificent than he had imagined. The dunes rolled like waves frozen in time, and the silence was so deep it felt almost holy. Occasionally, he saw tiny desert flowers that bloomed stubbornly despite the harsh conditions, their colors bright against the endless sand. Birds flew overhead, casting fleeting shadows that disappeared as quickly as they came. Thomas walked with a sense of purpose, stopping every now and then to make notes, sketch the landscape, or simply breathe in the sharp, dry air. By midday, the sun had climbed high, and the desert's beauty began to reveal its danger. The heat was oppressive, and Thomas could feel the sweat running down his back. He drank water from his small supply, but he was careful not to waste a single drop. The guides had warned him. The desert was merciless, and a careless traveler could quickly find himself in trouble. Thomas knew this, but he also believed that he could handle whatever came his way. He had survived rough conditions before, and he felt confident in his strength. Then the storm came. Without warning, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The wind began to whip through the dunes, carrying grains of sand that stung the skin like tiny needles. Thomas tried to protect his face and eyes, pulling his scarf tightly around his head, but the storm grew stronger with every passing minute. The caravan struggled against the wind, and before long, Thomas realized he had lost sight of the others. The sandstorm was fierce, and in the chaos, it separated him completely from the group. Panic started to creep in, but Thomas forced himself to stay calm. He knew that fear could be as dangerous as the storm itself. Hours passed. The storm raged, and Thomas could barely see a few feet ahead. His feet sank into the shifting sand with every step, making progress slow and exhausting. He called out for the caravan, hoping someone would hear him, but his voice was swallowed by the roaring wind. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the storm finally started to weaken, leaving behind a quiet but desolate desert. Thomas found himself alone, surrounded by an endless expanse of sand, with no water left in his canteen and no sign of life anywhere. The first night was the hardest. Thomas huddled against a small dune, trying to protect himself from the cold that came swiftly after the sun disappeared. The desert, he realized, was not just a place of beauty, it was a place of extremes. During the day, it was scorching hot. At night, the temperature dropped sharply. He wrapped his scarf around his shoulders and tried to rest, but hunger and thirst gnawed at him. His mouth was dry and his tongue felt swollen. He thought about his family, his home, and wondered if he had been foolish to come alone into such a dangerous place. Morning brought little relief. His lips were cracked, and his skin burned from the sun. Thomas forced himself to move, hoping to find a source of water or at least a sign of life. Each step was harder than the last. His legs ached, and his vision sometimes blurred from exhaustion. He tried to ration what little energy he had, taking one step at a time, reminding himself that stopping completely would mean certain death. The desert was testing him, and he realized he was in a fight he could not afford to lose. Days blurred into one another. Thomas wandered endlessly, searching for water, food, or shelter, but the desert offered none. He learned to recognize the faint signs of life, a bird circling high in the sky, a cluster of small green plants, but even these were rare. Sometimes mirages appeared on the horizon, shimmering lakes or distant trees, only to vanish when he approached. These illusions were cruel tricks of the heat and thirst, and they tested his mind as much as his body. Thomas's body began to weaken. Every sip of water he had left was precious, and he drank sparingly. Hunger gnawed at his stomach constantly, leaving him irritable and exhausted. At night, he dreamt of food and water, his mind conjuring rivers, fruits, and cool shade. But morning brought only the harsh reality, unending sand, glaring sun, and the constant, oppressive silence. He learned to ignore the pain in his stomach and focus on the next step, the next hour, the next chance to survive. Despite the hardships, Thomas refused to give up. He remembered why he had come to the desert, to test his limits, to experience the world beyond the safety of civilization. Each day, he told himself that survival was possible, that help or a source of water could be just beyond the next dune. He looked for signs, tracks in the sand, distant smoke, anything that indicated another person or an animal. The desert seemed endless, but he refused to let hopelessness take him. One afternoon, as the sun reached its peak, Thomas collapsed under the weight of exhaustion. His body shook from dehydration, and he could barely lift his head. Every muscle ached, and the world around him seemed to tilt and spin. He tried to drink from a small puddle of water he found in a shallow depression, but it was too dirty to risk. He realized that survival in this place required not just endurance but careful judgment. Each choice could mean life or death. Time lost meaning. Thomas survived on hope alone, clinging to it like a lifeline. He counted the days by the position of the sun and stars, reminding himself that the desert, no matter how cruel, was still a world of beauty and lessons. He noticed the way shadows moved, how the wind shaped the dunes, and how animals left marks that spoke of water and shelter nearby. Slowly, his mind became attuned to the desert in ways he had never imagined. By the fourth day, Thomas was near collapse. His lips were dry and cracked, his skin burned and blistered, and his strength had nearly vanished. He had lost count of how many times he had stumbled, fallen, and struggled to rise again. The sun was relentless, and the nights were unbearably cold. He began to realize that he might not survive without help, and the thought both terrified and humbled him. In that moment, the desert seemed larger, older, and far more powerful than he had ever believed. Then, almost as if by fate, he saw it, a small plume of smoke rising in the distance. At first, he thought it was another mirage, another cruel trick, but as he focused, he realized it was real. Gathering every ounce of energy, he stumbled toward it. His heart pounded with hope, but he moved slowly, careful not to collapse. The smoke promised life, a chance to survive, and he clung to that hope like a precious lifeline. As he drew closer, Thomas saw a small hut hidden among the rocks. It was modest, built from clay and wood, with a few supplies stacked outside. His body ached with fatigue, and his mind barely registered the details. What mattered was that here, finally, was the possibility of survival. He did not know who lived inside or whether they would help him, but it was the first sign of human kindness he had seen in days. The thought of reaching shelter filled him with determination, and he pushed forward, step by step, toward the promise of life. Thomas arrived at the hut, almost too weak to knock on the door. The desert had stripped him of strength, dignity, and confidence, but it had not taken his will to live. He waited, shivering and exhausted, unsure what would happen next. Then the door opened, revealing a woman who would change his fate, a woman whose courage, compassion, and knowledge of the desert would become the reason he survived. Thomas barely had the strength to lift his hand to knock on the door, but instinct pushed him forward. The desert had taken everything from him, energy, hope, and even the clarity of his thoughts, but he was still alive. The moment the door opened, a pair of keen eyes met his, studying him carefully. The woman who stood before him was older than Thomas had expected, her skin weathered by years of desert sun, and her hair streaked with silver. She was small in stature but radiated a quiet strength. This was Iana, the Apache widow who had made the desert her home, mastering its secrets and surviving where most could not. For a moment, neither spoke. Thomas's lips were dry, his throat parched, and his body trembling. He tried to explain, but his voice came out as little more than a hoarse whisper. Iana, understanding more than his words could convey, gestured for him to come inside. She moved with a calm assurance, as if the desert itself obeyed her commands. Thomas obeyed, stepping over the threshold into the small, shaded hut, feeling an instant relief from the scorching sun. The temperature dropped slightly, and the walls seemed to absorb the heat, offering a fragile comfort. Inside, the hut was simple but functional. A small fire burned in a corner, giving off warmth and light. A few clay pots and utensils were neatly arranged on shelves, and some dried herbs hung from the rafters. Iana motioned for Thomas to sit on a low bench, then disappeared briefly, returning with a small cloth dampened with cool water. She helped him wipe the sweat and dust from his face and arms, the simple act sending shivers through his exhausted body. Thomas's mind struggled to grasp the reality. Here, in the middle of the desert, someone had chosen to help him, a stranger who had no obligation, no reason except perhaps kindness. Iana spoke softly, her words calm and measured. She asked him his name, where he had come from, and what had brought him to the desert. Thomas tried to answer, but he was too weak to form complete sentences. Instead, he gestured, pointing to the sand, the sun, the vast emptiness outside. Iana nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. She had seen travelers like him before, people who underestimated the desert's power and paid the price. Yet something in Thomas's determination, in his struggle to survive, seemed to touch her. Without hesitation, she decided to help him. The first challenge was nourishment. Thomas had no energy left to even consider food. His body was in shock from dehydration and hunger, and his lips were cracked and swollen. Iana fetched a small bowl and, after a pause, did something extraordinary. She offered him her own milk. In her culture, she explained quietly, milk from a nursing mother was considered sacred and life-giving, a last hope for survival. Thomas was initially hesitant, embarrassed, and unsure, but the pain in his body overpowered any pride. He accepted, drinking slowly, feeling warmth and strength returning to his bones. Every sip brought life back to his fading body, and for the first time in days, he felt hope. Days turned into nights and nights into days as Iana cared for him. She gave him small amounts of milk at regular intervals, carefully observing his condition. Slowly, Thomas regained strength, his color returning, his limbs less shaky. The desert outside remained harsh and unrelenting, but inside Iana's hut, Thomas discovered a fragile sanctuary. He watched her move, gather water from hidden sources, and prepare simple meals from what little she had. Each act of her survival skill amazed him. The way she found hidden waterholes, collected edible plants, and managed the unforgiving environment. It was a lesson in resilience and ingenuity, and Thomas soaked up every detail, knowing that it could save his life if he were ever alone again. During these days, Thomas and Iana began to communicate in small ways. Words were not always necessary. Gestures, expressions, and shared experiences bridged the gap. Thomas learned to trust her completely, surrendering his fears and doubts to her care. Iana, in turn, respected his spirit. She could see that he was not a careless traveler. He was intelligent, curious, and respectful of the desert, but he had simply underestimated its severity. Their connection was subtle but powerful, a mutual recognition of the human need for survival and compassion. As Thomas's strength returned, he began to explore the area around the hut under Iana's watchful eye. She showed him how to identify edible plants and roots, pointing out subtle differences that could mean the difference between nourishment and danger. She demonstrated how to find water in unexpected places, like under rocks or in the hollow of certain desert plants. Thomas was amazed at her knowledge, understanding that survival in the desert required not just physical endurance but careful observation and respect for nature. Every lesson Iana taught was a small victory for Thomas, rebuilding his confidence and reconnecting him to the will to survive. One afternoon, Iana took Thomas further into the surrounding desert to show him hidden signs that could guide travelers. She pointed out animal tracks, the direction of the wind, and patterns in the sand that revealed water sources. Thomas listened intently, absorbing every detail. He realized that the desert, which had seemed cruel and hostile, was actually full of signs and secrets for those who knew how to look. Iana's wisdom transformed the desert from a place of fear into a living, breathing world, full of lessons for anyone willing to pay attention. Despite the growing trust, the desert continued to test Thomas. One day, while gathering water with Iana, a sudden sandstorm appeared on the horizon. Thomas froze, fear gripping him as memories of his previous ordeal returned. But Iana remained calm, guiding him to a sheltered canyon. There, he learned that fear, while natural, could be managed with knowledge and preparation. The storm passed, leaving Thomas with a deeper respect for the desert's power and for the wisdom of the woman who had saved him. In these moments of quiet recovery, Thomas began to reflect on life, survival, and human kindness. He realized that Iana's act of giving her milk and her time to help him had gone far beyond simple charity. She had risked her limited resources, her comfort, and even her safety to ensure that he survived. Thomas understood that survival was not just about physical strength, but also about the willingness of others to extend help, even when it was inconvenient or challenging. It was a lesson that would remain with him forever. As days passed, Thomas began to regain his confidence and mobility. He practiced walking longer distances under Ayana's supervision, gradually building strength and endurance. He also learned to prepare basic survival tools, make simple traps for small animals, and carry water efficiently. Every skill he acquired was a lifeline, a way to repay the trust that Ayana had placed in him. Their relationship, once fragile and tentative, became one of deep respect and shared purpose, a bond forged in the harsh crucible of the desert. By the end of the second week, Thomas had transformed. He was no longer the weak, desperate traveler who had stumbled into Ayana's hut. His body was stronger, his mind sharper, and his heart filled with gratitude. He knew that without her guidance, he would not have survived. Ayana had given him more than food and water. She had given him knowledge, hope, and the belief that humans could help one another in the harshest circumstances. Evenings were spent by the fire, where Thomas would ask questions about the desert, Ayana's life, and her experiences. She spoke sparingly, but each word was filled with wisdom. Thomas listened, fascinated by her understanding of nature, survival, and human resilience. He realized that she was a guardian of the desert, a woman who had learned to thrive where others would perish. Her strength was quiet but profound, and Thomas felt honored to be in her presence. By the time the third week arrived, Thomas could see the desert differently. It was no longer just a place of danger. It was a teacher, a mirror reflecting both human vulnerability and resilience. He had survived hunger, thirst, and fear not just through luck, but through the guidance and compassion of a remarkable woman. Yana had given him a second chance at life, and he vowed to carry the lessons he had learned far beyond the desert's borders. Thomas had been under Yana's care for several days now, but the reality of his situation slowly settled into his mind. His survival depended entirely on hers. The desert outside remained harsh and unrelenting, and without her knowledge, guidance, and most importantly, her milk, he would not have lasted another day. Each morning, as the sun rose and burned away the coolness of night, Thomas woke with a body still weak from dehydration and hunger. His arms trembled, his legs ached, and his mouth was dry beyond what he had ever imagined possible. Yet with every sip of Ayana's milk, he felt life returning to him, like warmth flowing back into frozen veins. Ayana moved silently around the hut, performing her daily routines with a grace that Thomas began to admire deeply. She collected water from hidden sources, prepared simple meals from desert plants, and tended to her small garden of herbs and vegetables that somehow survived in the arid soil. But her most important role, at least for Thomas, was her care of him. She gave him milk at regular intervals, carefully balancing his needs with the limited amount she had. Thomas could see that she herself was careful, conserving her strength while giving him what he needed most. Her selflessness struck him profoundly, and he realized that human kindness could be a matter of life and death in a place like this. The first few days had been physically excruciating. Thomas felt lightheaded with every movement, and even lifting his arms was a challenge. He had never experienced weakness like this before, and it frightened him. But Ayana's presence was reassuring. She spoke softly, guiding him to drink slowly, to rest when he needed to, and to pay attention to every small improvement in his strength. Her calm and deliberate actions gave him hope, showing him that survival was possible, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Thomas began to trust her completely, allowing himself to surrender to her care. With each day, Thomas's body began to regain a little strength. His vision cleared, his steps became steadier, and his muscles slowly regained some of their lost power. Drinking the milk was a ritual now, a lifeline that connected him to life itself. Every sip seemed to restore not just his body, but also his spirit. Thomas realized that survival was as much about hope and mental strength as it was about nourishment. Each time he drank, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a tiny flame that refused to be extinguished despite the desert's cruelty. As Thomas recovered, Ayana began to teach him more about the desert. She showed him which plants were safe to eat, which roots could provide water, and how to read the land for signs of animals or hidden springs. She explained the movements of the sun and the stars, teaching him how to navigate when landmarks were scarce. Thomas listened intently, absorbing every detail. He realized that the desert, which had once seemed an endless, hostile wasteland, was actually full of life and guidance for those who knew where to look. Each lesson from Ayanna was a step toward independence, a promise that one day he might survive without her direct care. Despite the improvements, Thomas's survival remained precarious. There were moments when his body ached so much that even lifting a cup of milk seemed impossible. There were nights when he woke shivering, drenched in sweat, as his body fought against the exhaustion and dehydration. Yet every time, Ayanna was there. She encouraged him, adjusted his blanket, and provided the nourishment he needed to continue. Thomas came to understand that the bond between them was built on trust and necessity, but it had also grown into something deeper. He depended on her not only for food and water, but for hope, guidance, and the reassurance that he could survive. One morning, Thomas awoke feeling unusually strong. The muscles in his legs and arms no longer shook with the slightest movement, and he was able to walk around the hut without staggering. For the first time in days, he felt almost normal. He looked at Ayanna, who was tending to her garden, and realized how much he had come to rely on her. Her care had been unwavering, and her knowledge of survival had saved his life. Thomas understood that his survival was not a matter of chance, but of the generosity and wisdom of another human being. Ayanna continued to monitor him carefully, knowing that even small missteps could be dangerous. She taught him how to conserve energy, how to ration water, and how to recognize the signs of heat exhaustion or dehydration. Thomas followed her instructions meticulously, realizing that every small action could have a profound impact on his ability to survive. He practiced moving through the desert, first under her watchful eye and then gradually on his own. Each successful step increased his confidence, and he began to feel a sense of mastery over the environment that had once seemed so threatening. As Thomas grew stronger, he also began to learn patience. The desert taught him that survival was not about rushing or forcing progress, but about understanding the rhythm of the land and respecting its limits. Ayanna's lessons went beyond the practical. They were also philosophical. She explained that the desert demanded humility, observation, and respect. Thomas absorbed these lessons eagerly, realizing that his previous approach, rushing forward with confidence and little preparation, had been reckless. Now he understood the importance of balance, of moving carefully, and of relying on wisdom as much as strength. Thomas's recovery was not without challenges. There were moments of doubt, when the memory of thirst, hunger, and exhaustion returned to haunt him. There were days when the wind blew so fiercely that even a short journey outside the hut became a struggle. Yet each time, Ayanna's calm guidance helped him regain composure. She reminded him that setbacks were part of survival, that persistence and patience were as important as nourishment. Slowly, Thomas began to internalize these lessons, developing not only physical strength but also mental resilience. One evening, after another day of careful recovery and learning, Thomas sat by the fire with Ayanna. He watched the flickering flames, reflecting on everything that had happened. He had survived days without food or water, teetering on the edge of death, only to be saved by the generosity and skill of a woman he barely knew. Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude, realizing that survival was never just about individual effort. It was about the kindness and wisdom of others, about the small, selfless actions that could mean the difference between life and death. During this time, Thomas also began to appreciate the emotional dimension of survival. The desert was not only physically demanding, but emotionally exhausting. Loneliness, fear, and despair were constant companions. Ayanna's presence, her care, and her quiet companionship helped him navigate these feelings. He realized that human connection could be as vital as food or water, that compassion could nourish the spirit just as milk nourished the body. Thomas's admiration for Ayanna grew, not only for her knowledge but for her courage, selflessness, and humanity. By the end of this period, Thomas had regained most of his strength. He could walk for longer distances, carry water, and even gather some food from the desert under Ayanna's guidance. But he knew that his recovery was not complete. The desert remained unforgiving, and survival would always require vigilance. What had begun as a desperate struggle to stay alive had transformed into a journey of learning, understanding, and mutual respect. Thomas had not only regained his health, but had also gained wisdom, resilience, and a profound appreciation for the power of human kindness. Thomas's time under Ayanna's care also taught him humility. He understood that survival was never solely about strength or skill. It was about awareness, patience, and the willingness to accept help when it was offered. Each day he spent recovering reminded him that the desert was both a teacher and a judge. It rewarded those who respected its rules, who observed its patterns, and who honored the knowledge of those who had survived it before. Iana had been his guide, his teacher, and in many ways his lifeline. Without her, Thomas knew he would not have made it. In the quiet moments, Thomas reflected on the lessons he had learned. The desert had stripped him bare, leaving him vulnerable and dependent. But in doing so, it had revealed the true essence of survival: courage, humility, patience, and the kindness of others. He realized that every challenge, every struggle, and every moment of despair had shaped him into someone stronger, wiser, and more aware of life's fragility and beauty. And all of this had been made possible by Iana, the Apache widow who had given him the greatest gift: life itself. Thomas's body had grown stronger over the past weeks, but he knew that true survival in the desert would require more than strength alone. With Iana's guidance, he began to take small steps toward independence. Each morning, as the sun rose and painted the dunes in shades of gold, he ventured a little further from the safety of the hut. Iana followed at a careful distance, watching him with quiet vigilance. She encouraged him to move slowly, observe everything around him, and trust the knowledge she had shared. Thomas understood that every lesson, every observation, could be the difference between life and death. Their days became a rhythm of learning and exploration. Iana would lead him to small waterholes hidden beneath rocks or shaded by desert shrubs. She showed him how to collect dew in the early morning, how to dig shallow holes where moisture would accumulate, and how to find water by observing the behavior of animals. Thomas listened intently, absorbing each detail and practicing every technique. Slowly, he began to see the desert not as a barren wasteland, but as a living environment full of secrets and life, if only one knew how to look. Food remained a challenge, but Iana taught him to identify edible plants, roots, and fruits that could be found in the desert. She showed him which cacti could be eaten safely, how to extract moisture from them without harming his body, and how to use herbs for flavor and nutrition. Thomas practiced harvesting small amounts of these plants, careful not to take more than necessary. He also learned to observe animal tracks, understanding which creatures might lead him to water or signal danger. Every small skill he mastered gave him a sense of independence and confidence he had never felt before. Beyond the practical lessons, Thomas also learned the importance of patience and observation. Iana taught him that rushing through the desert was dangerous. The desert demanded respect, attention, and careful timing. He learned to watch the movement of the sun to measure time, observe the wind to predict weather changes, and notice subtle differences in sand patterns that could indicate hidden water or approaching storms. These lessons were not just about survival. They were about connecting with the land, understanding its rhythms, and becoming a part of its natural flow. One afternoon, Iana took Thomas to a narrow canyon, a place she described as both a refuge and a classroom. The canyon walls provided shade, and the rocky terrain offered natural protection from the wind. She encouraged Thomas to practice finding water in hidden crevices and to use simple tools to extract it. Thomas worked diligently, his hands learning the techniques through repetition and guidance. The sun beat down on the canyon, but the work was rewarding. Every drop of water he found was a victory, a sign that he was learning to survive on his own. As Thomas's skills improved, he began to move further from the hut, exploring areas he had previously avoided. He learned to recognize safe paths, to avoid dangerous terrain, and to carry water efficiently for longer distances. Each excursion built his confidence, and he started to feel a sense of accomplishment he had never experienced before. The desert, which had once seemed an endless and terrifying expanse, now felt like a place of opportunity and learning. Thomas realized that survival was not just about enduring hardships, but about mastering the environment with patience, respect, and skill. Iana's guidance extended beyond physical survival. She also taught Thomas how to conserve energy, how to rest effectively, and how to protect himself from the harsh elements. She explained the importance of timing, showing him that moving during the cooler hours of morning and evening reduced the risk of heat stroke. She taught him how to build simple shelters from rocks and brush, how to create shade, and how to signal for help if necessary. Thomas absorbed every lesson eagerly, understanding that knowledge and preparation were as vital as strength and nourishment. Despite his growing independence, Thomas never forgot the care that had saved him. Each morning, he drank the milk that Ayanna provided, understanding that it was still his lifeline. Every sip reminded him of her generosity, her courage, and her wisdom. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, knowing that without her, he would never have survived the desert's first brutal days. This gratitude motivated him to learn quickly, to respect the land, and to become capable of surviving on his own. The bond between Thomas and Ayanna deepened with every passing day. They communicated with gestures, shared tasks, and worked together to navigate the desert. Thomas learned to anticipate her movements, understand her instructions, and respond to her guidance without hesitation. Ayanna, in turn, trusted him to follow the lessons she had taught. This mutual trust was crucial, for the desert could be unpredictable and mistakes could be fatal. Thomas realized that survival was not a solitary endeavor. It required connection, trust, and cooperation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of red and purple, Thomas and Ayanna sat together on a rocky outcrop overlooking the desert. The wind had died down, and the silence was profound. Thomas reflected on how far he had come, from a weak, desperate traveler barely able to walk, to someone learning to navigate and survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. He felt a sense of pride and accomplishment, tempered by humility. He understood that the desert had tested him, shaped him, and taught him lessons he would carry for a lifetime. The night brought another lesson. As the temperature dropped sharply, Thomas learned how to stay warm using simple techniques. Ayanna showed him how to create insulating layers from available materials, how to position himself to reduce heat loss, and how to maintain energy levels overnight. The desert nights were still cold and challenging, but Thomas now faced them with knowledge and preparation instead of fear. He began to understand that every challenge could be met with the right combination of skill, observation, and patience. Over time, Thomas's confidence grew. He began to venture further from the hut, exploring new areas, observing wildlife, and testing his abilities. He practiced finding food and water independently, using the techniques Ayanna had taught him. Each successful endeavor reinforced his sense of capability and resilience. The desert, once a place of fear and desperation, had become a living classroom, and Thomas was a student determined to learn everything it had to offer. Through these experiences, Thomas also developed a deep respect for Ayanna. He saw her not just as a caretaker, but as a teacher, a guide, and a model of resilience. Her knowledge of the desert, her ability to survive with limited resources, and her courage in facing the harsh environment inspired him. Thomas realized that survival was not just about physical endurance, but about wisdom, observation, and the willingness to learn from those who had mastered their environment. By the end of this period, Thomas had transformed. He was no longer the weak, desperate traveler who had stumbled into the desert. He had become a careful, knowledgeable, and observant survivor, capable of navigating the land with skill and confidence. Yet he remained humble, aware that the desert could still be dangerous, and that every day required vigilance and respect. The lessons he had learned from Ayanna were invaluable, teaching him not only how to survive, but how to thrive in an environment that could easily take a life. As the days passed, Thomas began to see the desert as a living, breathing entity. He observed the patterns of the wind, the movement of the sun, and the behavior of animals. He understood that the desert had its own rhythms and rules, and that survival depended on harmony with these forces. Ayanna's teachings had opened his eyes to the beauty and complexity of this harsh environment. What had once seemed empty and unforgiving now appeared rich with life, mystery, and possibility. Thomas also reflected on the human dimension of survival. He understood that his journey was not just about mastering the desert, but about the kindness, generosity, and wisdom of another person. Ayanna's care had saved his life, and her guidance had transformed him. He realized that human connection, trust, and cooperation were as essential as food, water, and shelter. The lessons he had learned went beyond survival. They were lessons in empathy, gratitude, and respect for others. By the time Thomas was ready to venture even further into the desert, he felt a sense of readiness he had never known before. His body was strong, his mind alert, and his spirit resilient. He had learned the value of patience, observation, and careful action. He had learned that survival required not just effort, but wisdom, humility, and trust. And above all, he had learned the extraordinary power of human kindness, embodied in the woman who had given him life when he had almost lost it. By the time Thomas had spent several weeks under Ayana's guidance, he had transformed in ways he had never imagined. The young traveler who had stumbled into the desert weak, dehydrated, and almost lifeless was now strong, alert, and full of knowledge about survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. His body had regained strength, his mind had sharpened, and his spirit had been tempered by the lessons of patience, observation, and resilience. Yet, even as he grew more capable, Thomas knew that leaving the safety of Ayana's hut would be a challenge. The desert still demanded respect, and every step beyond the familiar paths would test his skills and courage. Thomas spent the early mornings preparing for what he knew would soon be the journey back to civilization. Yana had insisted that he move slowly, build confidence, and carry enough supplies to survive in case of emergencies. She helped him gather water in small containers, showing him how to ration it carefully. She reminded him of the edible plants and herbs he had learned to identify and how to use them for nourishment along the way. Thomas packed methodically, aware that each choice could influence his ability to survive. He had learned to plan, observe, and anticipate the desert's challenges, and now it was time to apply that knowledge in practice. Before leaving, Thomas spent time reflecting on what he had experienced. He realized that survival was never just about physical strength or endurance. It was about understanding, respect, and connection. Ayana had given him more than water and food. She had given him wisdom, patience, and a chance to see the desert as a teacher rather than an enemy. Every skill he had acquired, every lesson he had absorbed had been a gift. Thomas felt deep gratitude, understanding that without her, he would never have lived to see this moment. He resolved to carry the memory of her generosity and courage with him for the rest of his life. The morning of departure arrived, and Thomas and Ayana shared a quiet meal together. It was simple: water, a small piece of bread, and some desert herbs, but it felt like a ceremony of survival. Thomas felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He was eager to return to the world beyond the desert, but also aware that this journey would test his knowledge and resolve. Ayana gave him a final set of instructions, reminding him to observe carefully, move deliberately, and respect the land. She encouraged him to trust his instincts and the skills he had developed. Thomas nodded, feeling ready, yet humbled by the experience that had changed him so profoundly. As he stepped outside the hut and onto the sun-baked sand, Thomas felt a surge of independence. The desert stretched out before him, vast and challenging, but he no longer felt fear. He remembered the lessons Ayana had taught him: how to read the tracks of animals, locate hidden water, and use the landscape to guide his path. He recalled the methods for finding shelter, conserving energy, and managing limited resources. Each memory gave him confidence, and he took his first steps into the desert fully aware of the responsibility that came with survival. The journey was difficult, but Thomas was prepared. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the sand shifted under his feet, but he moved carefully, timing his steps to conserve energy and avoid the hottest hours. He stopped occasionally to drink water, rest in shaded areas, and check the horizon for landmarks. The desert, which had once seemed unending and merciless, now felt like a landscape he could navigate with skill and knowledge. Thomas's confidence grew with each step, and he realized how much he had changed since the day he had stumbled into Ayana's hut, weak and hopeless. During the journey, Thomas reflected on the lessons he had learned. He understood that survival was about more than avoiding death. It was about observation, preparation, and respect for the environment. He thought about Ayana's patience and wisdom, how she had taught him to move with the desert rather than against it, to see the signs of life where others might see only emptiness, and to trust in both his knowledge and the kindness of those who had helped him. Each step forward was a tribute to her guidance and a reminder of the extraordinary human connection that had saved his life. As days passed, Thomas encountered challenges that tested his skills. He faced scorching heat, shifting sand, and moments of fatigue that threatened to overwhelm him. Yet, he relied on the techniques Ayana had taught him, moving slowly, observing carefully, and using every bit of knowledge he had acquired. He found hidden sources of water, harvested edible plants, and used the terrain to his advantage. Each success reinforced his confidence, and he felt a sense of mastery over the desert that he had never imagined possible. The desert, once a place of fear and despair, had become a landscape of learning, growth, and personal triumph. Along the way, Thomas also reflected on the emotional journey he had undertaken. He remembered the despair of those first days, the desperation that had made every step a struggle, and the moments when he had feared he would not survive. He thought of Ayanna, who had given him life, strength, and hope, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Survival, he realized, was not only a physical challenge but a deeply human one. The kindness, wisdom, and generosity of another person could be as crucial as food and water, and Thomas carried this truth with him in every careful step he took. As he approached the edge of the desert, the landscape began to change. The harsh sand dunes gave way to scrubland and distant hills, signs that civilization and water were not far away. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and reflection. He had survived the desert, grown stronger, and learned lessons that would remain with him forever. Yet he also felt a pang of sadness, knowing that his time with Ayanna, the woman who had saved him, was coming to an end. He resolved to honor her guidance by living with the awareness, patience, and respect for life that she had instilled in him. Finally, Thomas reached a small trail that led toward a distant settlement. The signs of human life, smoke from chimneys, faint sounds of voices, and traces of roads filled him with hope. He knew that he was no longer completely dependent on others for survival. He had learned the skills and wisdom necessary to navigate the desert independently. Yet he also carried with him the memory of the woman whose milk had given him life and whose knowledge had taught him how to survive. The desert had been harsh, but it had also been a teacher, and Thomas emerged from it not only alive but transformed. As he walked toward the settlement, Thomas thought about the future. He knew that he would never forget the desert or the lessons it had taught him. He would share the story of survival, courage, and human kindness with others, honoring the extraordinary woman who had saved him. The journey had tested him physically, mentally, and emotionally, but it had also revealed the power of patience, observation, and compassion. Thomas understood that survival was never just about endurance. It was about learning, adapting, and valuing the help and wisdom of others. When Thomas finally reached the outskirts of the settlement, he looked back toward the desert one last time. The golden dunes stretched endlessly, a reminder of both danger and beauty, despair and triumph. He remembered the fear and weakness he had felt when he first entered, and he compared it to the confidence, knowledge, and strength he now carried. The desert had stripped him bare, but it had also built him up, teaching lessons that no map or guidebook could provide. Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude, knowing that he had not survived alone, but with the help, wisdom, and care of another human being. Thomas's story spread quickly among those who heard it. People were amazed at how he had survived the desert, relying entirely on his wits and the care of Ayanna, the Apache widow. Yet for Thomas, the most important part of the story was not the danger he had faced, but the lesson he had learned. That kindness, wisdom, and human connection could be as essential as food and water. Ayanna had given him life when he had been on the brink of death, and he carried that gift with him every day, honoring her in thought, action, and gratitude. In the years that followed, Thomas often reflected on his journey. He never forgot the lessons of the desert, the importance of patience, observation, preparation, and humility. He remembered the fear and desperation of the first days, the slow recovery under Ayanna's care, and the gradual building of strength and skill that had allowed him to survive. Most of all, he remembered the extraordinary generosity of the woman who had nurtured him when life seemed impossible. Her milk had been more than nourishment. It had been hope, courage, and the promise of life itself. Thomas's experience changed him profoundly. He learned that survival was not only about the body, but about the heart and mind. He understood the importance of compassion, generosity, and human connection. The desert, which had seemed merciless, had taught him humility, patience, and resilience. And in Ayanna, he had seen the extraordinary power of one person to change another's life entirely. Thomas carried these lessons into every part of his life, sharing them with anyone willing to listen and honoring the memory of the woman who had given him a second chance at life.